Good afternoon. I'm so delighted to see familiar faces, new faces, and to welcome you all here for the APS's Spring Conference on Women in Science, Achievements, and Barriers, which begins now for 2 panels and a plenary session, and will continue all day tomorrow. So please, delete whatever else you had in your schedules for tomorrow and come back, because it's going to be a fantastic set of discussions and conversations. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Adriana Link. I'm head of scholarly programs here at the APS. And we'll just say a couple words before I hand it over to Susan Lindy, who will moderate our first panel on Pathfinders. So today's conference is the first of 2 international conferences that will explore the history of women in science, the present state of science and society, and the opportunities to create a more inclusive and diverse practice of science. And I'll note that, yes, this is the first of 2 conferences, and if you would like to come and be part of the conversation in October, the deadline for that call is this coming Monday, so get those proposals in. Both of these conferences complement the recent opening of the APS Museum's new exhibition, Pursuit and Persistence, 300 Years of Women in Science. The exhibition, if you haven't yet had a chance to visit, it is across the street and will be open today and tomorrow. And it explores how women scientists have overcome obstacles to achieve breakthroughs, make places for themselves in science, and to help others along the way. So a couple quick housekeeping points. This will be a truly hybrid event. So we'll have folks in person. We also have folks streaming online. Hello. We'll have a series of presentations that will take place via Zoom. We'll have some recordings. So please bear with us. This is the first time that we have so many technical components in play. But again, I'm very grateful to all of you for being here and your patience as we navigate those. Those who are presenting here will be offering shortened remarks of pre-circulated papers. Those are available for download on the website, and if you need the password, it's WIS June 2023. But please don't cite or circulate those without permission from our presenters. We are going to be having conversations on social media, so please, if you haven't already checked out our Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, the hashtag to follow along is APS Women in STEM. And then finally, for those of you who are in person and you need bathrooms, there are bathrooms in the back. There's a women's room there. There's also a women's room downstairs as well as a men's room, and there's a bathroom upstairs as well. So lots of places to go if you need to. Finally, I'd like to now turn things over to Susan Lindy to get the conversation started with panel 1 on Pathfinders. Dr. Lindy is the Janice and Julian Bears Chair of the History and Sociology of Science at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research interests include the history of radiation genetics and human genetics, history of biology, and science and technology in the Cold War. And she's written several books about these topics, including Suffering Made Real, The DNA Mystique, and Moments of Truth in Genetic Medicine, and most recently, Rational Fog, Science and Technology in Modern War. And I'm glad that that's the only fog that we're now contending with as the air seems to clear. So with that, I will turn it over to Susan, and thank you all for coming.
Is this on? It's on. Okay. Thank you, Ada. It's wonderful to be here and to see this group and to know that we have a mix of disciplines and mix of interests here. And I think this is going to be a very productive and important meeting. And so I'm really glad to be joining you. The format that we will have today for this session, and I think for all of them, is that I will introduce all 3 of the speakers so that you have a sense of who they are. They will present their brief versions of their papers. I have a short commentary where I will raise some questions, and then we will open up the question session to everyone. And I believe, Ada, correct me if I'm wrong, everyone is everyone online, everyone here physically, and I have no idea how I'm supposed to keep track of the people who are online. Okay, I'm not going to worry about it. All right. So our first session is on Pathfinders, and if you had a chance to look at these papers, you will hear about them. Our first speaker is Claire Parkinson, and Claire is a climate scientist who has worked at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland, for the past 45 years. She's done field work in both the Arctic and the Antarctic, and has developed a computer model of sea ice. She's been heavily involved in satellite sensing of the Earth, especially sea ice, and she's written books on satellite Earth observation, climate change, the history of science, and has co-written and co-edited books on sea ice, climate modeling, satellite data, and the careers of women at Goddard. She's a member of the American Philosophical Society, as well as Phi Beta Kappa, the National Academy of Sciences, and the National Academy of Engineering. Our second speaker is Daniel Assen. Daniel Assen, an associate professor in the Department of History at Rutgers University, Newark, where he teaches East Asian history. Dr. Assen's research focuses on the history of forensic science in modern China. His book, Death in Beijing, Murder and Forensic Science in Republican China, came out in 2016, and it examines the history of homicide investigation and the politics of forensic expertise in early 20th century Beijing. Dr. Assen is currently researching the history of fingerprinting in 20th century China as a complex field of knowledge and practice that developed at the intersections of policing and forensics, civil registration, and scientific disciplines such as physical anthropology and medical genetics. And finally, Carolyn Wexler, and Carolyn is a combined MD, PhD student in my own department at Penn. In fact, she took my course on genetics and genomics in the fall and at the University of Pennsylvania. And she's completed the first 2 years of medical school, and she's pursuing her PhD in the History and Sociology of Science department. Before graduate school, she graduated with a BA in the History of Science from Harvard College in 2019. She has worked in pediatric oncology, basic science research, and her work centers on the development of physicians' and scientists' professional identity. She largely focuses on the history of cancer research and the rise of genetics in medicine. So I will turn it over to Claire.
Thank you.
Okay, you can stand up.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, a pleasure to be here, and I certainly look forward to everybody's talks. In contrast to many of the speakers, I am a scientist rather than an historian of science, but I do feel that the example that I'm using today of women in Antarctica is a good example of the theme of this conference of barriers and achievements. So, as most people know, there were a lot of heroic expeditions to the Antarctic back in the early 1900s. They were all entirely men that were down there. A lot of women wanted to go, and I've got two quotes here that kind of reflect that. One was from 3 women who were seeking spots on Ernest Shackleton's expedition, and they said, "We do not see why men should have all the glory, and women none, especially when there are women just as brave and capable as there are men." And then the other quote, the Institute of Polar Studies at Ohio State has folders full of Admiral Byrd's letters of applications from women. He nicely did reply to these applications, but they all had the same result. And he did individually reply, so I give him credit for that. But they were all common in terms of things like, "I do not doubt for an instant that you are as well equipped, both mentally and physically, to be a member of the expedition such as ours as any man. However, it is not a question of whether women can stand up under the hardships, but simply that our party will be composed entirely of men." At that time, in the early 1900s, it was clearly a sufficient explanation. We're going to be all men, and that's it. Fortunately, that's no longer the case, but at that time it was. A breakthrough that came through was in 1956 when the Soviet Union sent a woman down on an expedition to Antarctica. Then in the 1960s, New Zealand and the United States finally broke through and allowed females in Antarctica. And then in the 1980s, the British and Argentina allowed women, and then in the 1990s, South Korea did. So it's been a struggle. My talk now will focus on the US case. And in the US case, the breakthrough in 1969 came from a team led by Lois Jones. She was a researcher who had sent in a number of proposals to the National Science Foundation, NSF, asking to get funded for research in Antarctica. And she repeatedly got back the message that your proposal is really good and we're ready to fund it, but you have to send a man down to collect the samples rather than being allowed to go down yourself. Her institution argued about this, and finally in 1969, NSF said, okay, we'll let her go down, but it's got to be entirely a female expedition. We are not going to mix genders on an Antarctic expedition. So she went down, she picked 3 people, one just an undergraduate, and they really lucked out because they got to be on the first team of female scientists going down to Antarctica from the US. So that's how it started. Now, a few years later, I was at Ohio State wanting to go to Antarctica, and Terry Hughes, who's the rightmost figure in this picture, Terry was leading an expedition. He knew my purpose of being there was to get to Antarctica, and so he nicely put me on his team. The National Science Foundation did reject me, so I got a letter saying that I was rejected for this team, and I was ready to accept the rejection. Terry wonderfully stood up for me, and he said, she's the one I want on this team. And NSF relented and said, okay. Since then, many other females have gone down on co-ed teams, and in fact, now it's just as, a female has just as much chance as a male does to get on an Antarctic expedition. Now, part of the reason that Terry had a chance of getting me on was because in the meantime, Title IX had been passed by the US Congress in 1972. Once Title IX was passed, an awful lot of things changed for females who wanted a fair chance of doing various things. So Title IX was a huge plus there. Once females got down, they certainly proved that they could do the job and that they had the mental toughness. And I've got 2 quotes here to illustrate that. One is from Ian Willens, who was a researcher who was extremely proud of receiving what was called a Macho Driller Award. So Ian went down, and he and a teammate drilled down 18 meters of ice faster than anybody else had done it. So they got this Macho Driller Award. This is Ian's comment a few years later, an update on his award. A teammate and I held the record for drilling 18 meters of ice in 5 hours. That's really something, isn't it? And then that record was taken over by 2 women who drilled 18 meters of ice in 3 hours. He goes on to say, well, they did have good weather, but more important is that they thought of a way to do it much faster. The days of pure brawn are over. It is more important to think things out. Unfortunately, I can't see. Ooh, we got a problem here. Okay, so the other quote here just illustrates that females had the toughness also to do Antarctic research. In the next 6 slides, I take 6 very important topics of Antarctic research and show a female who has done major work in that topic. First is Antarctic ozone hole, very important because ozone protects us. Ozone in the upper atmosphere protects us from ultraviolet radiation. Susan Solomon is a huge leader in that field of understanding Antarctic ozone. The ice sheet is extremely important. There's a huge amount of ice down there. It's over 2 miles deep in large regions of the Antarctic. If all of that were to go into the ocean, sea level would rise over 60 meters. So a huge amount of ice. Robin Bell has been a leader in understanding the ice sheets. Sea ice is my field, and the plot shows that Antarctic sea ice unexpectedly was increasing up until 2019 in terms of the satellite record, and then decreased really, really fast. So it's very different from the Arctic, which has been decreasing much more consistently for years. The Antarctic atmosphere, one leader is Marilyn Raphael from UCLA, and she's developed an important index for the atmosphere. And then Ellen, whom I already mentioned, Ellen Mosley Thompson, does ice core work and is a leader in that. And then modeling to get what might happen in the future, Sophie Nowicki from the State University of New York at Buffalo has been a leader in that. Now that is just like the tip of the iceberg, those 6 people. This shows the attendance at a 2019 conference that was celebrating the 50th anniversary of the 1969 case of Lois Jones. And if you look at all those females there, this conference was a wonderful conference. It was full of science, it was full of camaraderie, it was full of all sorts of things. And there was such appreciation of the young people for the older ones who had gone before, and such respect all the way around. So it was wonderful, wonderful. Note the last day of this conference, October 18th, 2019. That is the day that there was the first all-women spacewalk. And of Jessica Meir and Christina Koch. Both of those two had worked earlier in Antarctica. I emailed Christina about this conference. She said that she shared it with Jessica, and they were both thrilled about the conference and also very much recognizing the importance of the female advances in all fields. And she replied from the International Space Station. So, and then my last slide is simply to say that the rest of the talk has shown tremendous progress, and it's been a huge success story, but it's not like everything's perfect. And so this slide is the documentary Picture of Scientists. I highly recommend it for anybody who hasn't seen it. But it highlights these 3 women, and on the bottom picture, Jane Willenbring was badly abused during field work in Antarctica. The other 2 were not Antarctic researchers, but their stories also relate very much to what females still have to endure in the science field. Thank you.
Daniel?
Okay. Just get. All right. So today I'm going to be discussing the history and representation of women in Chinese forensic science through the case of Ma Jianhua, a fingerprinting expert of the Beijing Public Security Bureau. Ma's long career began in the early 1950s in the aftermath of the Communist Revolution and continued for decades under Maoism, and then into the economic reforms of Deng Xiaoping, who set China on the path toward free market capitalism in the late 1970s. Ma Jianhua played a pioneering role in 2 ways. First, as a member of the first post-revolutionary generation of Chinese forensic experts, and second, as a woman in a field of science for which women have historically been underrepresented in China. Ma began her work in forensics during a moment in the early 1950s that saw intensive efforts to build up the new criminal justice system of the People's Republic of China. During the first decade of PRC rule, at least 16 women entered the various forensic fields, a number that almost certainly represents an undercount. The women who were members of the initial cohort of trace evidence experts, which was Ma's field, would become highly accomplished, in some cases rising to positions in the Ministry of Public Security and achieving significant records of casework and research. Others, such as Ma Jianhua herself, became publicly lauded models of forensic expertise whose stories were told in magazines and other popular media, even as they held more modest positions and had less of what might be called field-shaping influence. Ma's own claims to fame, which were first described in profiles that were published in Chinese popular media during the 1980s, revolved around several points shown here, which are discussed in more detail in my paper. While it is difficult to quantify what the gender breakdown of Chinese forensics was during the early decades of Ma's career, this question can be examined more readily for the post-Mao period. One useful source for examining this question is the Dictionary of Contemporary Forensic Science Personages in China, an official biographical directory of about 3,700 Chinese forensic experts that was published in 1996. While this work does have limitations as a source of information on the scale of women's involvement in Chinese forensics, as a point that I discuss a little bit more in my paper, it nonetheless provides a baseline of information that would be difficult to obtain otherwise. A survey of all entries for women in the various forensic subfields given in this work yields this table. Only 343 women, as you can see at the very last row at the bottom, are listed in this work in total, a figure that represents about 9% of the 3,704 mid-level and higher forensic experts who are listed, while women do account for a greater proportion of the experts in some subfields, such as forensic toxicology or forensic accounting. They only represent 5 to 6% of those listed in the sections on legal medicine, which includes forensic death investigation and crime scene trace evidence, the two largest and most essential areas of forensic science within China's criminal justice system. And it should be said that it is likely that women make up a greater proportion of practicing forensic experts in China today than they did during the 1990s when this information was compiled. While, as these figures suggest, there have been significant gender disparities in Chinese forensic science since 1949, there are nonetheless a number of women who have achieved reputations as recognized forensic authorities, both among other officials and within popular culture more broadly. In my paper, I discuss several popular texts that praise Ma Jianhua and other women for their forensic expertise, but also for their persistence in meeting the hardships associated with reconciling the obligations of a demanding career on the one hand and popular expectations, popular in contemporary China, about childbearing and household work being the inherent duties of women on the other. A passage from one of these texts is shown here. The larger context of such texts is China's shift to free market economics and the renewed, quote, domestic role orientation among urban Chinese women, as sociologist Jiping Zuo has described it, as well as the expanded areas of potential work-family conflict that this economic shift has led to. The construction of the subject position of female forensic expert as one associated with these kinds of conflicts and hardships is significant on a few different levels, as I talk about in my paper. I guess moving towards the conclusion of my presentation, what I would say now is that the way that these kinds of texts primarily frame these women's challenges as being about, the conflict between their work and the duties of being a wife and mother, as this piece says, likely ignore other factors that also play an important role. I can talk more about what those factors are during the question and answer session, but because my time is up, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Carolyn.
Can everyone hear me? Great. Thanks to Adriana and those at APS. Thanks to Susan and my co-panelists. I'm excited to share this work with you today. In 1953, with a budget of $15,000 and a headquarters consisting of a single desk in her own apartment, Helen Coley-Knotts founded the Cancer Research Institute. She did so with a mission of, quote, understanding the immune system and its relationship to cancer, at the time, a controversial idea. By this time, Knotts had already dedicated 15 years of her life to the study of cancer immunotherapy. Despite having no formal medical or scientific training, she built a research organization from the ground up that continues to drive cutting-edge research in the present. 70 years later, the CRI continues to thrive and now boasts a multi-million-dollar research budget. It's funded some of the most important cancer research advances of the past 50 years, including work on checkpoint inhibitors that won the 2018 Nobel Prize. Cancer immunology, which broadly attempts to harness the immune system to fight cancer, is now at the cutting edge of oncology. But as you might imagine, it took quite a bit of work to get to this point. My paper introduces Helen Coley-Knotts as a key actor in this history and describes her 60-year career. I ask why she's not often discussed in immunotherapy history, despite her many efforts. What kinds of work are necessary to build a scientific field, and how's that work gendered? How can Knotts' career help us to expand our definitions of what might count as scientific participation? In this talk, I'll quickly introduce Knotts and her work, and then offer some thoughts on how to understand her career through the lens of scientific labor. Finally, I introduce the term scientific sponsor to describe Knotts and explain how this can help us to expand our understanding of scientific labor. Helen Coley-Knotts was born in 1907 in Sharon, Connecticut, and grew up surrounded by cancer research. Her father, William Coley, pictured here on the left, was a surgeon who is now known as the father of immunotherapy for his development of a mixed bacterial toxin vaccine to combat cancer, Coley's toxins. While Coley and some others used this treatment with some success in the 19-teens, by the 1920s, it and immunotherapy more broadly had begun to fall out of favor with the rise of radiation therapy. The toxins and immunotherapy more broadly fell into obscurity after Coley's death in 1936. But beginning in the 1940s, despite having no formal training herself, Knotts took it upon herself to draw attention to her father's work on the toxin treatment, which she believed were both effective and important. Knotts' work began as a family history project initially, but quickly morphed into complex and sophisticated scientific and clinical research. She combed through her father's case reports and compiled thousands of data points, analyzing trends over years' worth of data. She also taught herself about oncology and immunology by reading thousands of scientific papers and composing detailed summaries of them. By the 1950s, her project had become so large that she needed outside funding, and so in 1953, she founded the CRI and turned her attention towards raising money. But alongside planning benefits and dinners, she remained deeply involved in the scientific side of things, working closely with her scientific advisory board and organizing clinical trials herself until her retirement in the 1990s. But ultimately, Helen Coley Knotts is pretty much exclusively remembered for her role as a fundraiser, and always, always in the shadow of her father's work. But I suggest that Knotts' contributions go far beyond her fundraising and form the foundation of the field as it currently stands. We can better understand this by looking at science not through the lens of particular scientific advancements, but as a particular kind of labor. French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu has argued that scientific fields are structured by the movement of capital, or resources and money, and that understanding who controls different kinds of resources can help us to understand how power and work function within science. Looking at the movement of capital can help us to bring Knotts' career into focus, and perhaps it can help us to better understand how women have been excluded from science and how we can better appreciate their contributions in retrospect. I look at Knotts' ability to wield three kinds of capital. First, economic capital, or money and resources. Second, cultural capital, or credentials and credibility. And third, social capital, or social networks. So starting with economic capital, this makes sense because Helen Coley Knotts is remembered mostly as a fundraiser, essentially for her ability to wield economic capital. And this in and of itself is underappreciated as a means to shape scientific research. Controlling scientific funding is an incredibly powerful means of directing research agendas, especially in an environment of scarcity. But more importantly, fundraising, especially in the mid-20th century, was particularly an appropriate and acceptable area for women to participate in science, especially upper-class women. Maybe the most famous example of this is Mary Lasker, a New York socialite who raised millions of dollars for cancer research and features prominently in some other books about cancer. And you can see Knotts and Lasker together here in this photo from the 1980s. So it's clear that Knotts' economic capital was important, but because she's exclusively remembered for this, and I think in large part that's because of her gender, this is where I think that we're missing something. So moving on to consider cultural capital, this idea of credentials and credibility. Despite having deep, sophisticated scientific knowledge, enough to write 18 monographs on immunotherapy, the first of which you can see here on the left, Knotts clearly lacked cultural capital, or her credentials. She didn't have any formal scientific or medical training, no MD or PhD, and thus many scientists and others that she approached didn't take her work seriously. Of course, even if she had had a scientific credential like an MD or a PhD, Margaret Rossiter has shown that post-war American biomedicine wasn't exactly a friendly place for women, so Knotts still might not have been taken particularly seriously. Instead, what she learned to do was to harness and wield others' credentials in her own favor. Most notably, she became very close to Lloyd Old, a renowned and respected immunologist that you can see here on the right. Old would become the scientific and public face of the CRI, and Knotts began to trade on his credibility to build up her own. And this brings us to number 3, Knotts' use of social capital, or her networks. Knotts relied heavily on networks of scientists and physicians to keep her projects going. She initially used her father's relationships with several colleagues to get the project started, and also relied on introductions to scientists from her brother, who was a surgeon. But she then strategically built her own relationships with scientific insiders in order to gain access to research conversations and to build faith in immunotherapy more broadly. On the left, you can see Knotts with the Scientific Advisory Council, notably all men, and you can also see her on the right conversing with Lloyd Old again. So Knotts was able to build this network by securing key footholds in the scientific community, people like Lloyd Old, who could reassure others about a fringe field like immunotherapy. In fact, Knotts referred to 1971, the year that Old joined the CRI, as the turning point for the organization, because she observed that after his arrival, leading immunologists began to flock to the CRI, even though she had been writing to them herself for 20 years. In sum, over her 60-year career, Knotts learned to wield not only financial resources, but to strategically build credibility and networks of collaborators to ensure the success of immunotherapy long-term. To summarize, I argue that Knotts was a key figure in early cancer immunotherapy. Even though she wasn't doing what we tend to think of as scientific labor, she wasn't performing experiments. But her work was crucial to the development of the field and to others' ability to do traditional scientific work. Looking at science through the movement of resources allows us to see Knotts and others in a new light. I want to conclude by introducing the category of the scientific sponsor to describe Knotts. Sponsor, I feel, reflects her fundraising and her administrative work, but also her role in actively drawing attention to the field and to coordinating networks of supporters, which would be crucial to the field's later success. We often see scientists in this role, people like Sydney Farber, who's pictured on the left of this slide. But considering a category of sponsor independent from experimental work allows us to consider people who've been excluded from traditional scientist roles in the past. Another example of someone who's a sponsor might be Rachel Carson, pictured on the right, who, though she was a scientist, was most influential on scientific agendas through her narrative writing and through her public speaking. Ultimately, what I argue for is a more expansive definition of scientific work. We need to look at scientific labor beyond what happens in the laboratory. When we do so, women and others who've been excluded from traditional narratives and spaces quickly come into view as really important scientific actors. Thanks.
All right, I have just a few comments that I see some of the overlaps in these three papers, and I would say all of them deal in one way or another in different ways with what I would call credentials or authority, who belongs where, who can be in certain spaces, who counts as a participant, and how do those get established. So I'm going to propose they interrogate what makes an outsider, what exactly makes a woman an outsider, and this is a part of Margaret Rossiter's work where she explores how outsiders who are female threaten the authority of the scientific enterprise. That's one of the things she's able to document empirically. I was a student of Margaret Rossiter at Cornell University, and I had the great privilege of learning from her about exclusion, outsiders, territorial segregation, hierarchical segregation, the harem effect, credentialism, honorary men, the bright young man theory, compensatory awards, the professional meanings of the smoker. Believe it or not, a smoker is an explicit strategy to keep women away from the meeting. The anti-nepotism rules and how gender intersected with them, the Matilda effect, and all of these wonderful ways of seeing processes that are functionally very, very difficult to see and in some cases almost invisible. So what are the systems that keep some people difficult to see? I'll say this, in the Rossiter tradition, these papers help us interrogate the threat involved in permitting women to be part of a scientific enterprise. So is it embarrassing to bring a woman scientist to Antarctica? Is it embarrassing to listen and value the contributions of people who do not hold PhDs or MDs, despite the fact that the vast majority of scientists who lived before the 19th century did not have PhDs? And so how did that credential become the defining property of what it meant to be a scientist? And Margaret, of course, says that it has to do with the threat of women. Are women embarrassing because they should be home taking care of the children? The emphasis on domesticity in some of these stories was sort of intriguing to me. And how does that matter? Now, Claire mentions something in her paper which I just want to touch on and see if there's interest in a broader discussion, and that's the roles of sexual harassment in keeping women out of scientific fields. Very, very powerful. This problem, or by which I mean an empirical documentation of this problem, historically is absent even in Margaret's work, and that is not for lack of interest in figuring out what happened. It is because this is a phenomenon that is extraordinarily difficult to access. We can see the problem in brutal detail after the 1990s because you can interview and speak with people, but it's the kind of, we have testimony lawsuits. But historically, it is by definition hidden, secret, invisible process of exclusion, discouragement, intimidation, a powerful mechanism for getting rid of women when they occupy places they do not belong. And one of the things that, when we talk about the pipeline, look, I was a DEI advisor to the School of Arts and Science at Penn, and we talk about the pipeline, but this question of active harassment, which keeps people out of fields, is not often often explicitly addressed. It's all kind of cleaned up. It's about recruitment. It's about making, providing opportunities. But the underside of that is what keeps women out and how many people are discouraged from scientific careers in this way. So Claire's story, I think, I have to admit, I was envious of you at that 1974 photograph of you at Antarctica. I just love that. I mean, that's amazing that you were able to go. And part of your story is that you were able to go because of the mentorship of a single particular man who chose to make it a priority to stand up for you. This is a common theme in the history of women in science. There is a man who has the power to intervene, to protect somebody at a crucial moment. And that's exactly what he did. You mentioned a couple of things that I would welcome further elucidation on. You talked about toughness, and honestly, there was one person you described in the paper who had she was working, they were all losing weight, they were eating 6,000 calories a day, and they couldn't get enough food because they were working so hard in this very, very cold environment. And that's that overcompensation, which is a strategy for women in science. And maybe some comment, having done this yourself, I'd welcome some further elucidation. How tough do you have to be to go to Antarctica? I don't think I could go. So what does it mean to be tough and go to Antarctica? And also what I would say is really present in your story is that it's not just a matter of justice, it's a matter of good science. So you open science to people who are qualified, creative, have good ideas, are smart, and that way you build a better science. And I think that's one of the best arguments for all DEI. Daniel's paper is also about place, and I would compare it to Margaret's work on government science. That is, these are forensic scientists who are doing something for the state. They are recruited. They serve the purposes of the state. They have relatively short training. They abandon their families for the cause, and there's sort of an emphasis that it's presumably nothing could be a bigger sacrifice than to abandon your family. But I would welcome a comment from him, and I was thinking about American Men and Women of Science, which was a very important resource for Margaret's work, where she could use these massive databases, these surveys of how many people were in different fields. And this is similar to what you were using, Daniel, which was, I think you called it a dictionary of forensic science. And so apparently women don't handle dogs, but they do handle clerical work, and they do chemistry, but so I was sort of interested in I know this can't be true, but it's so consistent with the American experience, and I wondered if something like women as chemists and women as clerical workers somehow has a transnational, international meaning in the 20th century, borrowed from Euro-American networks. In other words, how in the world does clerical work always end up in women's lap? Okay, I'm coming. And then finally, so some comment on that. And then finally, Carolyn tells us this amazing story of a person who was really at best a footnote in most accounts. She managed to process and read all these papers and books. She created this new institute. She collected clinical records. And her story is also consistent with earlier studies in that the best predictor of whether a woman would be a scientist was to have a family member who was a scientist. That would tell you, that was a likely way you would get there. What I would really like to learn more about, and you didn't mention in your presentation, but you talked in your paper about the letter suggesting that she was mentally ill. And mental illness is psychological madness, mental illness is often something that can be used to undermine women intellectuals. It is often used that way, and I think we have a later paper by Michelle Flug on Glanville and madness. And so some kind of comment on what it means to be what is mental stability? Because having known, I don't know, I've known some scientists who I didn't think were all that stable. So, what does it mean? Like, who counts as a mentally stable person and who looks crazy? And how is craziness gendered, or how is mental instability gendered? And then that's all I have to say. And I guess we should ask for questions or let them respond. Okay.
Okay, well, that was a lot. A lot of things that I could comment on. But first of all, like in the Antarctic case, what many females think part of the reason why men did not want females going down was Antarctic expeditions tended to get a whole lot of press coverage for sort of the hero nature of, and the sense was, how can you be such a hero if there are females on there too? I mean, it was just a sense of it was no longer, this hero status. But one of the reasons that was actually given for why females can't go down to Antarctica, and this is just one of the reasons in that conference, the 50th anniversary, and when this was mentioned, the whole room just burst out in laughter. And so one of the reasons given was there are no hairdressers in Antarctica. Now, in terms of the harassment issue that you mentioned, that's extra difficult in a field campaign, and whether it's Antarctica or some other place. And the woman from the Picture a Scientist documentary who was harassed badly in Antarctica, the harassment was by her, she was a PhD student, it was by her advisor who was also the leader of the expedition. So how much chance do you have? So the harassment issue clearly is huge. Fortunately, most cases there are no harassment issues, but the few that occur, it's horrible. In terms of the pipeline, yeah, a lot of females do drop out as you go higher and higher up, and a lot of the reason is just discouragement, that you're not being treated equally. But I think there's also one other reason, which is, in general, in the past anyway, maybe not so much today, but in the past, men have been expected to provide for their families. And so it's harder for them to leave their job and drop out of the pipeline because they're expected to still be in it. Whereas females aren't burdened by that expectation. And so therefore that makes it easier to drop out. And since I know other people have to respond also, I'll leave it at that.
So there is some scholarship on police women in China, not specifically who are involved in forensics, but just more generally. And I think that is an important context for all of this, and it does speak to some of your questions. One thing that the scholar who did this work, who is a legal scholar named An Chi Shen, has shown is that there is very systematic discrimination against women who are involved in policing at all stages of their careers, from recruitment to promotion to the kinds of assignments that they have. And one of the points that the scholar makes and shows is that women are very systematically put into indoor administrative types of roles, which can involve a lot of the kind of clerical, type of work that you mentioned, but also at the same time, I actually suspect that practice also does have the effect of giving women more opportunities to manage fingerprint records, because that task can be understood as precisely that sort of administrative type of practice. And then as far as the question of why there are such different levels of women's involvement in the different fields, my understanding of it is that in the fields where women spend more of their entire careers within the context of police agencies, that there are fewer women. In fields where women come to policing from having attained earlier educational or occupational expertise. For example, if in toxicology, where it seems fairly common for the people who are involved in that field to, start out with a bachelor's, for example, or something like that in general chemistry, and then enter forensics from there, as opposed to people who are in forensic trace evidence, where they might start out as detectives or as other kinds of police officials and then receive that more specialized training. And then just very quickly, the question of sexual harassment, it is not something that I have seen explicit or specific discussion of in terms of forensics, but in terms of policing, again, leaning on this scholar's work, on Qi Shen's work, she finds that her informants say that sexual harassment cannot be a significant problem within Chinese policing, because women and men tend to be kept separate and for other reasons, but she also makes the point that her informants tended to adopt an extremely narrow definition of what sexual harassment is, to basically simply include things like forcible touching, instead of creating a persistent workplace climate of harassment, which I think is more in line with how it is understood here. And so it's possible that her informants were really kind of missing a lot that we might consider to be sexual harassment.
Oh, great. Thanks for your comments, Susan. And just to address sort of the two things. So first, in terms of the best predictor of women being scientists, being their family members, I think there's this really interesting thing, especially in 20th century medicine and biomedical research, where there's these sort of like dynasties, either sort of real or created, where doctors sort of pass down being a doctor or a surgeon or a researcher to their sons, and then sometimes their daughters, but they really prefer the sons. And in Helen Coley-Knotz's case, it's sort of interesting because she had a brother, Brad Coley, who also was a surgeon at the same institution where her father worked. And when she started the initial project, she basically handed off all of her files to her brother and was like, here's your research project. Like, go carry on Dad's work. And he just didn't do anything with it for 4 or 5 months. And so that's why, like, ultimately she decided to do it herself. But initially she sort of passed it off to him. She said, I'm not the right person to do this work. You have the network. You have all the skills and the credentials to do it. You do it. And so her whole sort of career and her whole story really comes as a result of her brother just kind of dropping the ball, even though he was the one who, by all accounts should have been sort of the heir apparent to their father's work. So there's some really interesting kinship structures, I guess, in this kind of research. And then on your second point, so this is in the paper, but I didn't talk about it in my brief talk. But what Susan's talking about is At the beginning of her of creating the Research Institute, Helen Kooley-Knotts approached Cornelius Rhodes, who's a very famous cancer researcher and sort of infamous now, for advice because he worked with her father. And he provided a lot of support for her at the beginning. But then when she founded the CRI in 1953 and started asking the Rockefeller Foundation for money, the Rockefellers knew Cornelius Rhodes and basically wrote to him privately to say, what do you think? What do you think of this person? And privately, in his letters to the Rockefeller Foundation, he basically said, don't trust her. She's a very eccentric lady. She doesn't have the mental stability to do this. You should understand that this would be a very risky person to give money to. So he essentially stabs her in the back, despite providing, this sort of support at the beginning. And I think it's a really interesting case and an example of what you're talking about, because he's offering reasons for not giving her money that go beyond just, oh, she doesn't have an MD, she doesn't have a PhD. And he specifically says she's eccentric and she doesn't have the mental stability and fortitude to do this. And there's been a lot of great work on this idea that, women are seen as not sort of physically or mentally able to do these kinds of work, even though that's clearly not true. From Margaret Roster's work, we know that there's many women scientists. We know that that's true in the present. We know that it's not a matter of not being able to, as you were talking about in the Arctic, but it's this argument that sort of gets voiced over and over again, but usually behind someone's back, which is very interesting. And I think it also speaks to the fact that it's not just about having the credentials, that the credentials look different on different people, right? That it's not just about having an MD, it's about whether people believe that that gives you the ability to then do whatever it is you're asking them to do. So, yeah.
10 minutes for questions. If anybody in the audience or online would like to ask a question, the floor is open. Lots of questions. Okay, we'll start with Leslie, and you can flag me down.
Hi, I'm Leslie Aiello from University College London. And I have a question for Daniel Lassen. Because being a biological anthropologist myself, I'm quite interested in what you said about forensics in China. And can you comment on whether the situation in China was different from that happened in this country or perhaps Western Europe? And whether there is anything specific to Chinese culture that might feed into some of the conclusions you were talking about?
Well, in terms of in the broadest scope of how forensics is organized, in China it's organized as a top-down sort of centralized enterprise that's primarily organized through police agencies, but has also over the last several decades there have also been forensic experts who work for courts and prosecutors' offices. And given China is a one-party authoritarian state, and what that means, at least for this case, is that there is a much greater level of standardization and top-down supervision than there is in a federal type of system. For example, here, where law enforcement is primarily organized through local levels. As far as other kinds of similarities or differences, one thing that Simon Cole, who wrote kind of the classic work on the history of fingerprinting here in the United States, found is that beginning in the early 20th century, there actually were a lot of women who became involved in fingerprinting and who were recognized authorities in it. And that forms a pretty stark China, where even though there were probably hundreds, maybe several hundred women who were either trained as police or were practicing as police in the early 20th century, it is really not until after 1949 that you sort of start to see women being recognized individually as specifically forensic experts. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you all for your talks and your research. I have a question for Caroline. I appreciated your introduction of the category of scientific sponsor, and I wondered if you could speak to whether you think that category would be more open to women, or perhaps it just has different qualifications than other modes of participation in science. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's a great question and an important one to think about, using that category outside of this particular case. And I think you correctly point out that it opens it transcends barriers in some ways and creates others. And I think one thing that's really interesting about the case of Helen Coley-Knotts is a lot of the reasons that she's able to succeed and to sort of transcend the barriers that exist for her are the fact that she has a lot of money. She's an upper class woman. She knows a lot of people. She has this family, relationship. And so I think that, yeah, the term scientific sponsor is, I think, useful to me in this particular case, and I think can probably be useful in other cases as well, because it sort of allows us to consider kinds of work that are really important to what happens in the lab but exist outside of it. But I think one of the major problems with it, and what means that it can't be sort of implemented usefully in every case, is that it really relies on a huge amount of privilege, just different kinds of privilege than might exist in traditional sort of scientific categories. But thanks for the question.
Hi, my name is Jenna. I'm a historian of science from Boston College. I really enjoyed all of these papers. I wanted to pick up on a comment that Susan made about why clerical work just keeps on ending up in women's laps, and I think that'll come up later on in a number of the additional papers that we'll see today and tomorrow. So here I'm thinking about Caroline and Daniel, both of your topics. So Helen basically indexing a field to create the field. Daniel, your historical actor, Ma, from what I understand, is doing this by hand. She's identifying fingerprints by hand without computers, which seems incredibly difficult. So when we think about indexing a field or indexing objects, what are ways that we can reimagine this frame of clerical work and see it as field creating, as knowledge making, as something that is often unpaid? So Caroline, you talk a lot about how Helen didn't always get paid for the work she was doing, and so scientific sponsorship is a way of getting paid for that kind of work. And how does that labor is quite brutal, maybe not in terms of macho drilling physical labor brutal, but if you've ever, had to address a huge amount of information and do it for years and years on end in terms of organizing it and making it accessible to other people, that's another form of brute force labor. So I guess the general question is, how do you think about clerical work, labor, and gender, and reimagine it in this way that centers it in the making of science?
Well, in the case of fingerprinting, the fundamental power of fingerprinting as an identification technique really derives from that kind of clerical work. And it was really the invention of the paper fingerprint registry in the last decade of the 19th century that made it possible to identify somebody on the basis of their fingerprints. And so I guess just thinking about your question, I think that it's extremely important work. I think that there is one source that I mentioned in my paper that I believe refers to this whole process as being miraculous. I think that how this connects with gender is a much more complicated question for me, because because there clearly are many men who are also handling this kind of work, and it is not clear to me from the materials that I've been looking at that handling this kind of these kinds of fingerprint searches and managing fingerprint registries is actually specifically being gendered. I tend to think that it's more that there are systematic practices that kind of push police women into these roles rather than the specific fingerprint practices as being gendered like that. But I really appreciate your question, and it is something that I have to do a lot more thinking about.
Yeah, thank you for this question. Reading your paper, I also had sort of the same observation and thought, and I think certainly in the U.S. context, in the 20th century, there's this sort of long tradition of associating women with clerical labor, right? Like women were the first computers, right? Literally just doing, tasks and calculation, things like that. So there's this sort of long tie between women and clerical work, at least in the U.S. context. And I think that part of that comes from, as you were saying, this sort of systems that put women in places where they don't have the credentials to do anything else. I think that's certainly part of it. I think there's this notion that clerical work is very boring, and it's not particularly heroic, right? Like maybe you get a heroic result at the end, but it's not particularly exciting to sit there day after day and sift through data. But I think particularly in medical research and clinical research, which in the age of big data is so much about just slogging through page after page after page of reports and cases, I think we're increasingly aware that that kind of clerical work is important, especially as in the medical context, doctors have to do it themselves with the EHR. So I think we're beginning to appreciate how important that clerical work is, how important it is to have, a searchable database, or just a base of, as you talk about indexing a field, something to work from if you decide that you're interested in this, and that women have been a big part of creating those bases of info, kind of by accident, kind of by design. I think it's a little bit of both. But I think because it's not particularly exciting, it gets sort of forgotten, right? But I think that there's also, I really love the way that you phrase sort of the brutalness of that kind of work, and that there's not this toughness that's associated with it. But one of the things that's really interesting to me about Helen Coley-Knotts and other women who are in sort of similar positions is the brutalness of just continuing to call attention to something. Like I think that's what's really interesting to me about Helen Coley-Knotts is that she does all this clerical work, she does all this boring work, but then she gets up every day and she says, this is important, you should pay attention. This is important, you should pay attention. And just that work in itself, I think, is incredibly important and something that's sort of underappreciated in all parts of scientific fields, that it's really hard to be the cheerleader for something over and over again, and it's even harder if people don't recognize you as somebody who can have that sort of influence on a field and who can call that field to the forefront.
Great. So I saw some more hands, but unfortunately we're out of time for this session. But I encourage you to make a friend in our short break, which we'll take now. But before that, please join me in thanking this really great group of panelists.